Russia. This is one of the most intriguing places to play in EU4, where you have the interesting countries of Novgorod and Muscovy in the west, while you have the hordes in the south and east. Given the dynamics of the Russian region, there's always an interesting story here. Muscovy at this time has an expansionist policy, which is why we see Novgorod getting taken over in almost every EU4 campaign. The expansion of Muscovy happens quite often in EU4, and this country's policy of expansion lasts for centuries to come. In a slightly different scenario, the hordes of Kazan and Nogai have a government type that means they constantly have to expand, or they'll collapse quite quickly due to low horde unity. Have you ever wondered though, how accurate is this region to play in, and what was Russia like in 1444? Today we delve into the historical accuracy of this region, and discuss whether Paradox could add anything to this region to improve it significantly. Also, we are going to do an Ulm trip if we get to 100,000 subscribers, so make sure to click that button. Right, let's get into the video. We are first going to discuss the most important inaccuracy, which is in the state of Muscovy in 1444. And there is a significant historical inaccuracy Paradox have chosen to ignore in order for the game to make sense. At the start of the game, Muscovy is in fact a tributary state to the Great Horde, and this relationship had lasted for centuries due to the Mongolian Empire. The Great Horde was weakening over time, particularly with invasions from Timur the Lame, and therefore this nomadic nation struggled to insert authority over Muscovy. At the start of the 15th century, as the Great Horde was becoming weak and unstable, Muscovy therefore decided to become independent and took a stand at the Olga River in 1418. This is obviously 36 years after the start date of EU4, so therefore, why didn't Paradox add Muscovy as a tributary state to the Great Horde? I think it's fair to say that if Muscovy became a tributary, it would be a lot harder for them to become their historical size. Though it's historical early game, Russia would become a lot more historically inaccurate in the late game. Given the way the game develops, Muscovy as a vassal to the Great Horde would not attack Novgorod, or be able to form Russia, and therefore it makes sense to have the game this way. Perhaps, however, there should be some sort of acknowledgement of the Great Horde having power over Muscovy, and maybe at the start of the game, Muscovy sends subsidies to the Great Horde for the next 20 years, unless Muscovy attacks the Great Horde and defeats them in war. Historically, Muscovy only stopped paying the Horde in 1476, so it would make sense for Paradox to add this feature. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. The next territory I wish to talk about is in the east of Muscovy, and it is known as the Vyatka lands. A Russian settlement appears here in the archaeological record between the 11th and 13th century, and it intensifies after the Mongol conquest of Rus. This place is geographically isolated from the rest of the Russian lands. The people who lived here sometimes accepted the overlordship of other Russian and Tatar states, but the people on this land had a large degree of independence. Sometime in the first half of the 15th century, Vasily I, Grand Duke of Moscow, took the Vyatka land from the Sudel line of princes and handed it to his brother Yuri. The people here therefore supported Yuri and his son Dmitry against Vasily II in the Muscovite Civil War, and Saint Jonah accused the people of destroying churches and selling captives into slavery in 1452. By the time the war had ended in victory for Vasily II, he subsequently organised several campaigns to subdue the people who lived here. The first two were unsuccessful, and the Muscovite generals were reportedly bribed, but eventually the third campaign was successful, and the Muscovites succeeded in taking over the land in 1459. The Muscovite army took Cutaline and Orlov, besieging the forts in this area until it surrendered. The people who lived on these lands therefore accepted overlordship and were forced to pay tribute. Sadly, despite the information we do have, not much is known about this place and the nature of its government. Perhaps this is why the game doesn't represent these people at all, because the historical records are scarce. But nonetheless, perhaps Paradox could find out more about this region and add it into the game. Someone in the Paradox forums also argued for these lands to be added within the game, but many people disagreed with him and stated that these lands were very irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. and should not be added into the game, as they effectively had a very limited impact on the world. I've seen this argument before with a few other things like the Greenland Vikings, and therefore I'd say it makes sense, but it's still worth considering. Another thing I'd like to discuss is just how historically accurate the vassals are within Muscovy. I think to give you a clear representation of the inaccuracy, we have to use Voltaire's Nightmare, and this will give you guys some indication of the amount of vassals historically. In EU4, Muscovy has hardly any vassals, while in Voltaire's Nightmare, Muscovy has 11 vassals at the start of the game. Now, similar to a few regions I've covered, and especially the HRE, it's not really worth Paradox adding tons of vassals, and only the important ones should really be added into the game. For my research, I wouldn't particularly add any of the unknown vassals in Voltaire's Nightmare. For example, the Principality of Zarorze, next to Balu Zero, has hardly any relevant information on it, and therefore I can't say it should be added into EU4. Another example is Kanchin, which is also apparently independent of Voltaire's Nightmare, but I found out they were annexed by Tavir in 1423. Having said all this, there are still a few changes that can be made. One of them I can see is Perm, which is a little confusing in historical reality. After freeing itself from the Novgorod Republic in the 14th century, Perm was supposedly two states, which this map shows, and was only united in 1451, when a house of princes of Perm gained control of both territories as vassals of Moscow. Perhaps therefore, the way in which Perm is represented in EU4 is not entirely accurate, and it needs to be split up in order to make it more historically accurate. The next thing I wish to discuss is the historical accuracy of the hordes. We've already discussed the Great Horde's relationship with Muscovy, so it's probably best to focus on the other hordes, like Kazan and Nogai. So how historically accurate are the Nogai Khanate and the Kazan Khanate? Well, from what I've read, it's very difficult for the game to represent these hordes in a historically accurate way. The game represents the EU4 nations as unified nation-state structures that didn't come into existence until late in the game, and this is particularly inaccurate when applying it to these sorts of nations. Voltaire's Nightmare, on the other hand, have represented these nations only taking a few provinces within the region, and historically, the Nogai Khanate were nomads, so their migration route ranged from the Danube River in Europe to old-time Mongolia. I'd also like to briefly mention that in-game, both Kazan and Nogai hate each other, whereas in historical reality this wasn't the case, and they actually had fairly good relations with not much war. The Nogai Khanate did once intervene in the Kazan succession, but overall it was relatively rare. Given both these points, I'd say it's very difficult to sufficiently represent the hordes, and perhaps what Paradox have done is good enough for the time being. What do you guys think though? Let me know in the comments. Let's now finish off with north of Russia and Novgorod, and discuss just how accurate the region was during the 1444 start date. On the border between Muscovy and Novgorod, it seems relatively clean and simplified, with a few Muscovite vassals on the border. Historically, however, there were more countries that surrounded the border, and like most things in EU4, it was a lot more messy in reality. I'd also like to point out that Marfa Beretskaya should be acknowledged in the national ideas of Novgorod. According to legend and historical tradition, she led the Republic's struggle against Muscovy between her husband's death and the city's eventual annexation by Ivan III of Russia in 1478. Let me know if you think I'm wrong though, and what other historical suggestions would you make to Novgorod within EU4? Well, thank you guys for watching, and I hope you've learned something new today. But do you think Russia should be made more historically accurate? Let me know in the comments. Goodbye for now. Shout out to our Patreons: J Erickson 321, Shadow Singer, Jado52, Kargon, Flyerton, Henriki, Redguard 76, Xiaomi, and Charlie Demarel. Your support means a lot, guys.